Welcome to Eyes on Books. My name is Susan Wheeler, and I'm here with my co-host, Stephen Savlov. Today we're talking about a book called The Exiles. It's written by Christina Baker Klein. Now, some of you may be familiar with her other books, namely The Orphan Train and also A Piece of the World. Now, both are historical novels that were grounded in American history. But her latest book, The Exiles, makes a bold geographic and cultural leap into London and Australia in the 1840s. Now, Steve, you can help me with this book a bit. I mean, I found this a riveting read into the British penal colony system. I mean, it was about four women, three British women who are accused, sometimes falsely, of crimes.
Right.
Thrown into the infamous Newgate prison
Right.
in London in the 1840s, and then sent off to a penal colony. How long did it take for them to get to that penal colony in Australia?
I think it was like 3 months.
3 months, 4 months? They were
Yeah.
on this, it used to be a slave ship that was converted to a ship for female convicts, right?
Right.
Yeah, and they endure these horrible, just appalling conditions en route
Right.
to Australia.
Right.
But this whole thing is intertwined with another story too. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that. The Aborigine.
Right. One of the main characters, her name is Mathena. She was an 8-year-old Aboriginal native. I guess that's what the British call them, natives. And her people were constantly being moved around by the colonial British, and always promised to make conditions better, but they did not.
Right.
And many of her tribe died because of poor nutrition and poor medical care.
Right.
And anyway.
Now this happened on an island just near Australia. It was called Van Diemen's Island, right?
Right.
And the woman you're talking about, the Aborigine, was from a tiny island right near there.
Right.
Is that right?
Yeah. The story goes, Mathena was in her homeland, wherever her family was, and the island was visited by Governor Franklin and Lady Jane Franklin.
Oh, and okay, and then in the 1840s.
Right.
In the 1840s.
Right, and so Lady Franklin picked out of all the Aboriginal children Mathena to take as her pet project, take her back to her home, and with the idea of civilizing her,
Yes.
having her wear clothes, shoes, and so on. And it seemed in this story is that Lady Franklin was saw Mathena as one of her pets. And she was a collector. So this is one thing she collected was a Aboriginal
Children.
child.
Oh, that's shocking to hear about that.
Yeah.
But that's what's so interesting in this book.
Right.
The things that actually happened during that period.
Right. And apparently during that period it was common, perhaps just for the upper echelon, to collect odd things such as skeletons and
well, this was the beginning of the Victorian era, right?
Right.
I mean, their big industrial revolution had passed, and they were into discovering the world in different ways, botanically, and with this curiosity about morbid things, and Aborigines were interesting to them, and
Right.
and various things. But Anyway, getting back to the main story and how this Mathena fits into the story. I mean, I thought that was what was kind of interesting as well, because the other characters that we meet along the way, actually, the three British young women, one of them, Evangeline, was key to the story. I mean, this is really about her. And Evangeline was a governess in London, correct? Right. In the 1840s, well educated, her father a vicar, and she is falsely accused of a crime and sent to the prison.
Right.
One of the other young women, whom we meet later in the book, is Hazel, who was a 16-year-old from Scotland. And from Glasgow, she was the daughter of a midwife. She too was thrown into prison because she stole a silver spoon at her mother's request.
Right.
And now there was a third woman, a British woman. That was Olive, right?
Yes.
And she was a little bit different now too than the others. She was a little more street smart.
Right. Yeah, she was. She actually met her on the boat coming over to the penal colony. Yes. So
the story is really about the three of them surviving not only this appalling prison, but the squalor of this convict ship, this former slave ship, that had these appalling living conditions. And it really, I think the author, that's why I'm anxious to hear from the author, to hear about her research into the appalling conditions in the prisons and the slave ship, and how they treated women, the role of women in society at that time.
Right.
And
they didn't really see women as equals.
Oh,
of
certainly
course.
not.
And even today, that's the case.
True, too.
but yeah, the on the convict ship, the women were put into the bowels of the ship in the very, very lowest level, right next to where the sewage goes.
Right. It was just appalling. The filth and the rats and smells and just everything. But all of these senses are described. I mean, it really almost makes your stomach turn to think about it. And I was on the verge of tears for part of this book too, because of the appalling conditions and what these women were going through.
Right.
Yeah. And then, another character in the book, Buck. What can we say about Buck?
Buck was a very angry man.
He was on the prisoner ship too.
Yeah,
but he was in charge.
Yeah, he was in charge, and he didn't treat the women very well.
Oh God.
And at one point, he got into a conflict with Evangeline. Right. And he for some reason, wanted to get even with her.
The revenge
factor.
Oh.
And he actually...
But we can't say what happens.
Yeah, we can't say what happens.
But this story is full of twists and turns and surprises. And, yes. On that ship, that 4 months on the Medea, that was the ship, I believe.
Right.
And then when they finally got to Australia, this Van Diemen's Land, Tasmania, as we know it now, once they were off the ship, they were assigned to live out their sentence there, which typically for the women, it was either 7 years or 14 years.
Right.
I think there were about 195 women on this convict ship. But they would live out their sentences as convict maids, convict servants, for to help with the colonization of Australia. And they had these women's penal colony ships because, why was it just women? Was it because there were too many men and they were in Australia?
Well, Australia didn't have any women. and they thought that they need to increase the population. So that's why they sent all these women to Australia.
To help populate.
Yeah, help populate.
And they did eventually merge into society over many years, but
Right.
comparing that with the British social system, with the open Australian system, not totally open, but rebuilding itself,
Right.
is a fascinating story unto itself.
Certainly, yes.
Right. So, but it does raise some big questions, that I'm curious about, the women's place in society, how literacy was an issue here, especially among the women.
Right.
Because only one of them, Evangeline, knew how to read and was literate. And then we meet the doctor who is on the ship,
Dr. Dunn.
Dr. Dunn. And he's an interesting character too, because he's only 27 years old, right?
Yeah, he was kind of the saving grace.
Absolutely.
For these women, because he didn't say he was against what was happening, but he would write letters and vouch for, like, Mathena or for
Right.
or Evangeline, so that they could get proper jobs
Right.
In Australia.
Right. He was a compassionate soul.
Yes.
And of course, when his first encounter with Evangeline, who was literate and educated, and
Right.
they talked about the Tempest, Shakespeare's
Right.
Tempest. Actually, the book The Tempest came up in this book several times. I can't wait to find out what that was all about.
I would like to know myself.
I know it.
I mean, I read it a long time ago, but I don't
Right.
really remember it.
Yeah, going to the land in the middle of the seas. I'm not
Right.
quite sure.
I thought one interesting aspect of the story, especially with Evangeline, was that the more, so to speak, quote unquote crap they threw at her, the stronger she got.
Well, at this point, it sounds like we've covered enough where we are ready for some big questions with the author, and that would be Christina Baker Klein, that we're going to meet today, who is the author of The Exiles.
We are privileged to talk with Christina Baker Klein, who was the author of Exiles, and as we said earlier, that she also wrote The Orphan Train and Piece of the World. And so we're interested in getting to know you and getting to know the background of why you wrote this book and so on. So can we start off by asking you to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hi, I live in New York City and I have a place in Maine. I'm the mother of 3 boys. My husband works in television, and I was born and raised in England and in the South and in Maine. And so I left Maine to go to college, and then never went back to live except in the summers. And my sister, I have 3 sisters, and we all have houses within 2 miles of each other up there.
Oh,
All right.
how wonderful.
That's it in a nutshell. All right.
Yeah.
Christina. Okay, Steve, you have a couple of questions.
How were you inspired to write this book?
So many years ago, I was a Rotary Fellow to Australia for 6 weeks. And when you do that, you're kind of an ambassador for this country, for America. But you also you take a deep dive into the culture of the country that you're in. And so I learned a little bit about the convict story when I was there. And then there were sort of 3 strands, I guess, that led to the book. One is that experience. Another is that I taught in a women's prison. Twice I taught women in prison, and was really interested in thinking about incarceration and what it does to people. And then the third is that I wrote a nonfiction book years ago where I interviewed 60 mothers and daughters. And I became very interested in women telling their stories of hardship in all these different kinds of ways. And so The Exiles is kind of pulling together all of those strands, I think. I read an article by a New York Times reporter named Lisa Belkin, who has since become a friend, but she was writing about the convict women and what it was like to parent on these ships. And it reminded me that I had read about it in a book called The Fatal Shore by Robert Hughes. And that book was very important in my research for this novel that I wrote. So,
Well, which gets into something else. Your research into all of this, well, you've had many firsthand experiences then with, being in Australia and diving into the history of the country and the penal colonies. But your research is like nothing I've ever run into in many other pieces of historical fiction, where you give such an incredible sense of, well, being on a slave ship for not the slave, the convict ship,
yeah.
for imagine, the women, in the bowels of the ship and the squalor that they were having to deal with, and the smells and it was incredible. And when I looked at your book and your acknowledgments, your bibliography, the major research that you had done to get the real descriptions of what the conditions were like, both in Newgate prison and on the ship, the Medea. Where did you have to go to find all of these pieces of work? Did you?
Well, I went to many of those convict of those prisons, those workhouses.
Really?
They called them female factories.
Okay.
And the one that I write about in the book, I went to multiple times, and I had multiple trips to Australia, and I went to England. I went to Newgate, which doesn't exist anymore, but there are lots of documents, and the Museum of the City of London has a lot of stuff. I went to the Docklands where those ships left from. They have a great museum, but interestingly, even though they're beginning to confront Britain's role in slavery, there is nothing in the Docklands Museum about these hundreds of thousands of people who were sent from England and Ireland and Scotland and Wales to Australia and starting a new country. So it's funny that England
They don't acknowledge that.
Much about that. Yeah.
That is fact. Well, you have opened up a whole new door and to all of this. And with all your research, you exposed us to some of the more horrific things. Were there any other interesting side facts that you didn't put in your book that you discovered? I've heard about, what was it? A flash mob in a prison with women acting out things to what was that all about? Do you know what I'm
I have
talking
the
about?
flash mob in the book, but
you do?
that was common. It was just a way. It was essentially a prison riot, but with humor. They were,
Oh, I see.
sort of. It was a very boisterous, jokey way of protesting. The severe conditions that were in those prisons.
And in dealing with their
there was a
environment.
lot that I couldn't put in. Like I had a whole section about. I was really interested in the bush rangers, who are these guys who essentially a lot of them were ex-cons, who would go off into the bush and start these communities that were pretty interesting. I describe a little bit. I think in the novel I have a character maybe talk about it or pass one, but I could, because I was writing from the perspective of these women, I couldn't figure out a way to really tell that story. But it's very interesting about the people who got out of prison there. And Australia was 9-to-1 men to women for a long time. The men had really nothing to do, and they didn't start families, a lot of them, and they became these kind of renegade outlaws. It was like cowboys gone bad, sort of.
Yeah,
So
like the Wild
that
West
was really
here.
interesting.
Right.
Yeah.
And then the women on the convict ships, they were there they were sent specifically for the purpose of populating this
That's right.
Wild West country. Yeah.
It's hard to believe that it was actually a government plan, but it was.
It is. Now, the penal colonies, they weren't just in Australia. They were also in, well, in early years, they were in American early colonies on,
Yes.
and also in India ever, or I don't know. Not
Sure,
India so
yes. I
much.
mean, it started here, and then there were all kinds of convicts sent over here. But then when we won the war, America said, we're not taking your convicts anymore. And that was how it began.
That was
That
it.
they started
Okay.
sending them to
The
Australia.
beginning. Okay.
Yeah.
Other questions we have for you. Now, the one thing I found that was very interesting is the story of Mathena. How do you say her name?
Well, there are a lot of pronunciations of her name. I always called her Mathena. Some people
Mathena.
call her Mathena, but actually, the Aboriginal person who is consulting on the the TV series, which is in process, but with the writer's strike, we don't know what's
right.
going on with it.
Okay. Okay.
But he calls her Matina.
Oh.
Matina.
Latina.
Well,
So, I mean, I don't know. I in my talks, I've always called her Mathena,
Okay.
but she was a real person, as you saw from the
yes.
acknowledgments.
That's
And
fascinating.
her story, I originally was only going to tell the convict story, but I just felt that it would be irresponsible not to include this contemporaneous story of what was happening to the Native people at the exact same time and in the exact same place. So it just didn't seem
It
like I
worked.
could get away with not addressing her story.
Okay, I understand. Because it felt like after reading that, I thought, oh my gosh, this could have been two books. Just the
Yeah.
story of the British convict women and all of that, and then a whole separate story of Mathena, and how she was treated, and that the experiment of trying to, what they did during Victorian times. They were so curious about people in native lands and different kind of customs that were not British and all of that. So, but that was very, very clever of you to include the two, but you ended up introducing them to each other towards the end of the book, right?
That's right.
And
Yeah, I mean, the through line was really that, as you know, John Franklin was the governor of
Right.
Tasmania, and so he was determining the fate of the convict women and also, of course, of the Aboriginal people. And so it was such a central story, her story. And if you go to Tasmania, you'll see statues of her and
Really?
a town called Mathena. They pronounce Mathena.
Wow.
And there are plaques and remembrances, especially more and more as Australia is becoming sort of more comfortable with addressing, what happened to these people when the colonists came over.
right. Okay, that's
Yeah.
fascinating.
How did you choose the characters that you put into the book? I mean,
Yeah.
did that come
Well,
out
after
did that come out of
so
your
I
research?
I wanted to have a pretty broad cross section of the kind of women who came over on the ships. And I also wanted to have a guide for the reader, someone who is herself a reader. The wonderful thing about Evangeline is that she loves to read. She's sort of lives in her own world of books, and she's utterly unsuited to that life. And so I felt that by starting the story with her, that it was sort of a way for the reader to get into this very different world.
Interesting character too, streetwise, and kind of balanced out the naivete of Evangeline. And
Yeah, Olive was a much more common type, and so
Yes.
was Hazel.
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 Oh,
Yeah.
Hazel, yes. I loved Hazel. 16 years old, daughter of a midwife from Glasgow, and very streetwise as well.
That's right.
Very
Yeah.
interesting characters. And then the character Buck. Wow.
That's right.
He was
Yeah.
something else. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the issue was, and characters like Buck were common because
I bet.
many of the sailors were former convicts, and
Right.
and they weren't regulated,
And he was
it
in
was very
charge.
hard
Yeah,
to
yeah.
control them.
Well, he
So it
was
was sort of the fox guarding the chicken coop.
exactly. Well, it made for quite a story and so many surprises in your novel and twists and turns and
Well,
I mean, yeah.
one of the observations was towards the end of your story, and I'm not going to give it away, but I wondered whatever happened to Buck. And all of a sudden he appears.
Yes, that was a surprise.
Yeah.
Now you mentioned that this is in the process of being filmed. Tell us a little bit about that. What's going to
Yeah,
happen?
I mean, it's exciting, but I was just talking to my friend Kristen Hanna about it, who has a lot of novels that are as I do, supposedly in development. With the writer's strike, everything is on hold, and there's no telling what will happen after the writer's strike. There's supposed to be a director's strike.
Right.
So,
Oh gosh, it
maybe
goes on.
even another one. So,
But getting
it's
back
all
to
kind of
yeah.
any of those projects that are in process are on hold. But it was optioned by the people who did Big Little Lies and
Oh,
Wild
how exciting!
and Gone Girl.
Oh
And
yeah.
they're wonderful, and I think it would be great if it happened. And the pilot that I've already read, I'm an executive producer, so I've been helping with it, and it's really exciting, but I don't know what will happen. And
So-
you kind of can't hold your breath. They pay you anyway as you go, so
Well,
it's
that's not
fine.
bad.
Yeah.
But
it will-
I would love for it to happen.
Oh, which brings us to another question. What other projects are you working on now? In the
I am
meantime, you in the
working-
meantime.
Yeah. Well, actually, I wrote a kind of long short story that will be an Amazon original. It's their story for the month of August. It's called The Scenic Route. So if you're a Prime member, you can get it free. And otherwise, I think it's like 99 cents or $2.99 or
I
something.
think we're out of time here, Christina. And so, Steve, this has been a fabulous.
Yeah, it's very
Enjoyed talking with
interesting.
you, and we'll look forward to reading your next books. And I
Yes.
do hope our viewers will absolutely discover The Exiles, a fabulous read. Thanks again,
Thank you so
Christina.
much. Thank you. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.